Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Berkeley Hillside Club. I'm Arlene Baxter, the first vice president, and it's my pleasure to be here in our beautiful historic club with our president, Eric Allman, who's going to be our featured speaker this evening. This is part of a long-standing tradition, almost a century, of presentations called fireside presentations that are on most first Mondays of the month. This is October 4th, 2021. And welcome to this beautiful building virtually. Since the pandemic, we have been coming to you live and in recordings through Zoom. But it's our pleasure to still be able to provide very good content and stay in touch with our community. So this evening, we're going to be, we hope, accomplishing two things. One is to introduce our membership to the backstory and a little bit more of the information about our new president, our 2021-22 president of the Hillside Club, Eric Allman. But Eric has a resume which is pretty outstanding. And so I also wanted many people just beyond our club members to have an opportunity to hear about his background, the evolution of Sendmail, which he wrote, and the development of the internet. So we're going to take you back to the early 80s, before something called the internet, when it was actually the ARPANET and other networks, before email was an absolute normal part of everyone's business life, certainly. And I just have to comment that we're doing this on a day when the current medium of Facebook, Waze, and Instagram crashed, and we saw the repercussions of that. So that was probably a future we could not have seen, just how incredibly dependent we all are on these tools. So I'm going to ask Eric to take us back to those early, very heady days before the internet, and how did you, Eric, become involved in specifically in email and the development of online communications?
Well, I wish I could say that I planned something very clever, but in fact, it was kind of an accident. I was working on a database management project at Berkeley called the Ingress Project, which turned out to be a pretty famous project in and of itself. But at some point we got a contract or a grant, I guess, from DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the same people who had funded the ARPANET back before there was a D before ARPA. And we got a connection on our machine, which was a really, by today's standards, tiny machine. You know, your smartwatch has more power than memory and everything than this machine did. But it did have a connection to the network. It was a PDP 1170. And so, of course, everyone in the department wanted access to the ARPANET. And we had a grand total of, I think, 16 ports, most of which were used by the researchers on the project. So we could spare 2 for everyone else in the department. And they had already set up something where people had terminals, you know, not monitors, not displays, not anything fancy, just ASCII text terminals in their offices. But they had to go into the mail room and use a plug board to say, okay, I want my office to be connected to this computer now. And there were 2 labeled Ingress. And of course, protocol said you were supposed to take it out when you were done so people could see that it wasn't in use, but nobody did that. And so people would just yank things and people would get into fights and so forth. And I was, you know, I think it was still probably part-time student and full-time staff then. And the last thing I wanted to do was get into fights between faculty members. It could be kind of vicious when they wanted to be. And so I looked at this and tried to come up with some administrative solution. At some point I realized, you know, what these people want is not access to the ARPANET. They want access to ARPANET mail. And so we did have a local network inside Berkeley, but it didn't talk to any other networks. And I said, I could make that network talk to that network. And thereby let people be on whatever computer they spend most of their time on and get the email out and back into their mailbox. And I did a really horrendously bad hack. It's kind of embarrassing how simplistic it was, but it got people off my butt. And that seemed like a good thing at the time. But if I can anticipate your next question, a group called the Computer Systems Resource Group or Research Group got another DARPA contract to build a standard operating system for the new internet. The time when I described it, it was still the ARPANET. Internet didn't exist yet. And there was a guy named Bill Joy who was a student, but was a catalyst for much of the creativity in the department at the time. And so he was looking, we had to implement all of these protocols that you needed for the internet. And, you know, he did the core protocols and stuff like that. But one of the protocols he needed was electronic mail, SMTP. And so he came to me and he said, so Eric, you know more about email than anyone else here. Why don't you do this? I remember I'm still being paid to do database management research, not systems research.
This is what time period?
We're probably talking, very, very early 80s.
That's about the time of this correction.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess this is a good time to point out the network was so small then that you could actually have a printed phone book with everyone who at least had authorized access to the network. There were always the hangers on and so forth. So this one is from November 1980. It's, you know, that thick, maybe my thumb. And it is a listing of every significant person on the ARPANET at the time. It's the ARPANET directory. The next edition was the DDN directory, which is when they switched over to the Defense Data Network, I think. And I am listed in this.
As am I. So I don't know whether
So
I feel special or as a dinosaur, but both of us are in that dynamic.
But, you know, it's kind of amazing that if you wanted to get hold of somebody on the internet, you could go to this book, you could find out their email address, you could find out their phone number, you could find out their physical address, because they're all in there.
That's right. And it was by machine.
Yeah, well, and, you know, people now think of Berkeley.edu as this big thing. Back then, I was the contact for the entire Berkeley campus.
Hope that gives people a sense of just how different. I'm not sure if it's an order of magnitude or several, but the difference in.
It's like 7 orders of magnitude.
Right. So it was a very, very, very different time. So if I were interviewing a musician, I would always start with, so what was your first instrument and how old were you when you picked that instrument up? In your case, it was a computer. When did you first get started in working, playing with computers?
Well, I was kind of a dweeb. Somehow, somebody in the school district at a school I didn't even go to decided it would be great to pick up these students and teach them something about computer programming, which was actually a brilliant move. And so I started doing afternoon classes where I had to actually bus to another school to get to the classes, and I was teaching Fortran. And I was about probably 13 years old then, which would have made it in the late 60s. And that seemed pretty cool to me, and I kind of took to it. And it didn't take it. So the way it worked was you the school district had an IBM 1401, which was one of the mainframes of the time. It was the kind of the business mainframe. And it wasn't used normally on the weekends, except if they had really big jobs. And so one of the staff there agreed to come down and supervise all of these, prepubescent kids. And Leonard Nowicki was his name, I remember. He was a great guy. And so we would go down there and we'd, use the key punches and do our little tiny decks of Fortran and feed them into the computer and so forth. And I got bored with this pretty quickly. And so there was a thing in the middle of the room which had like a keyboard and it could type stuff out and so forth. And it was never used. It's like, that seems really cool. Why can't we use that? And Leonard said, well, here's the manual. You figured out how to do it. And so I did, but then I had to figure out some reason to use it. And so I kind of started rewriting the operating system. And I rewrote the operating system to be much more interactive because it was all very batch at the time. So, if something went wrong, instead of having to abort your whole job, it would go type something out on here and you could say, here's how to fix it. And I got into a world of trouble with that because it turns out some of the operators there liked it better than the IBM operating system. And one of the managers came in and saw this thing he didn't recognize. And it's like, what's that? And totally flipped out. It didn't help that I also at one point switched the buttons, the start and stop buttons on the front of the computer, but, and I was banned for a while. I went from decks of cards that were like this to 2 boxes pretty quickly. So that was kind of a heady time. I made lots of mistakes, of course, but that's how you learn.
That is what, a 7th grader? That's
yeah, I might have been in 8th grade by then.
Maybe an impressive beginning. So, and from that into actually writing mail programs.
You've left out a few years in there.
A few years. Well, and there's also the whole development from ARPANET into internet. And
right.
Talk to us about basically what your involvement, what your aspirations were in those early years.
I think I had explicit aspirations. Those started to come later when it was really when it got to the internet and things were growing and we were starting to say, this could change the world. And I think to a lot of us, we really genuinely believed it was going to make the world a better place. People would communicate more, it would be a smaller world. One of the great highs of my life was when I got this call, actually, it was the second call that was a high of my life. Got this call from some guy in Chicago who wanted to configure Sendmail, which was the replacement for Deliver Mail that was crazy flexible. You could do just about anything in Sendmail. And he said, I wanted, do this weird thing. And it's like, why do you want to do that weird thing? But I explained to him how to do it. And then like a month later, he called up and said, I just wanted you to know I did that. And what we were doing was we were setting up a pen pal program between people in the Chicago public schools and people in the Moscow public schools.
Oh, very nice.
And remember, this was the Cold War. You weren't supposed to do this, but he figured out a way to make it happen. And it's like, cool. Kids in Chicago and kids in Moscow are going to get to know each other as human beings, not as enemies.
Right.
And the world's going to, unicorns and
sounds terrific.
Yeah. That is not quite the way things turned out, as we know today.
Right, especially today.
Especially today.
And I mean, there was that sense of, as you said, optimism, that this was going to be all positive, communication would be improved, we would, and in some ways that did happen. But
yeah, what we communication did improve a lot. You know, it became very, very easy to contact people all over the world. But what we didn't figure out was about the large, so most of us gave away our work back in the early days. You know, it's just kind of, we're a community. And of course you do something, you give it to people. I wrote Sendmail, I gave it away. And everyone else did too. In fact, this is the whole open source movement, which people go, oh, you know, that started in the 80s or something. That's garbage. IBM had a conference called Share in the 1950s. And guess what Share was all about?
Sharing, yes, indeed.
So, you know, that was not a new concept, but the network took it to a new level. Instead of carrying tapes into conferences and swapping tapes with people, which I've done, it became more like, oh, well, here we just type a couple of things and it's there now. So the sharing thing seemed to be, well, that's the basis of the network, of course. And then other things started to happen. And, you know, I can't point blame at any particular, you know, company or individual. There's several I could say at least contributed to the problem, but basically the money started to become too tempting. And people started to lose the concept that maybe the net, instead of being to improve humanity, maybe it was to make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And people started to do things that were pretty clearly against that kind of, if you will, the hacker ethos that I grew up on, and turned it into something very profit driven. And, you know, I think certainly there's a lot of stuff going on in the news today about companies that have knowingly and even intentionally hurt their own customers. You know, the obvious one is Instagram, where, you know, kids are being harassed and bullied and so forth. And it's coming out just today that they knew all about this. And in fact, they intended it, that, you know, it made it viral. It made people want to come in and read more.
Right.
And as long as they were reading more, and that meant they were watching more ads, and that meant, you know, they had more money to pull in more people. And somewhere along the lines, the idea of doing good kind of went out the window.
Got lost in the wayside. Well, and also,
And by the way, I just want to say, not everyone on the net is evil.
right.
You know, there's a lot of really, really good stuff going on the net, and a lot of people who are still doing just some amazing work and are really doing what they can to improve the world. Unfortunately, the people that make the news are not those people.
Well, and there was such a big change from the origins of it being research and academic related, and then the switch to business. Do you think that that was a significant part of that switch, or were other factors important as well?
That's a good question. I'm not completely sure I know the answer. The academia, in some sense, I've spent a fair amount of my career, not all of it, in academia. And there are some real similarities between academia and the commercial world. There's a lot of competition, which at its best is positive competition, and, you know, it's the way science works, but sometimes it's kind of vicious competition. And that's kind of where things are in the commercial world. I mean, I guess commercial companies at various times in history have sometimes said, you know, it's better if there's two healthy companies that compete with each other, but we're not against each other. We're not trying to kill each other. We're just trying to, you know, be there and so forth. But, you know, the whole, you know, you go back to Standard Oil and trust busting and whatnot. At some point, companies get so large that all they can think about is taking over. And that whole sense of productive competition seems to go out the window, and it's just like taking the entire prize for themselves.
Certainly Google has taken over the search engine world, as one example. One of the many distinctions that our speaker, Eric Allman, has was in 2014, he was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. And as part of your sort of acceptance acknowledgement speech, you shared some concerns there about the balance of power between corporations and individual users.
Hey,
It just
you've
strikes-
obviously looked at my talk more recently than I have.
I do my homework. But I'd be interested to hear you update those concerns now, or just elaborate on what we were just talking about as we look forward into, what is coming with the internet. How would you imagine that someone who was so deeply involved in early development, both how we use email and how we use it?
I think we are at a sensitive point in internet history. I mentioned the trust busters, PR and Standard Oil and stuff like that. And that was largely a acknowledgement that the companies had gotten so large that they no longer represented the needs of even their customers. It was just about extracting enough money as possible. And I think we may be getting to a similar point. Now, I'm not going to say that the history is the same now. The situation in the 20s was distinctly different than it is now. But I do think we are seeing a lot of companies trying to pretend that technology is neutral, not acknowledging the impact that they've had on society and the responsibility they have to take for that. I think smart companies would, Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple would all get together and say, guys, we need to back off a little bit. We may not make as much money, but at least we won't be, killing our customers in the process. That's never going to happen. But maybe in fact we need trust busters. And people tried to break up Microsoft. That failed, but I think it did shock Microsoft sufficiently that Microsoft actually pretty much got their act together and started behaving like, decent citizens, corporate citizens. And maybe the big folks need that kind of shock to their system.
And then we have the use of internet information for political reasons, which is, of course, something that I can't imagine that anyone foresaw. Talking about this sort of idyllic early use of email to communicate between kids in Chicago and Moscow, and comparing that to what we experienced with the last election and relations, legitimate or not, between Russia and this country, and how much of that was real and how much was fake. Anyway, we were thinking about the future, and I'm always interested in, since you were so active in the past, of what you could
don't go away with the impression that politics didn't exist on the internet before. There was a shared bulletin board system, international bulletin board system called Usenet.
Absolutely.
And it had, little channels where you can go in. So, comp.mail.sendmail was the one that was all about the program I wrote, and so forth, computer.mail.sendmail. And there was also SOC, society.politics. And so there were lots of discussions there. And some of them weren't very polite. There were, flame wars is what they called them, and aptly so. But at least those people were talking to each other. Now I think what we've done is, created the kind of echo chambers. And, I have to be honest, it's on both sides of the aisle. I don't have to actually engage with anyone who disagrees with me. I can hang around, and I'm a guy saying this. I live in Berkeley, and I'm a gay kind of liberal guy, and I'm vaccinated, and I have a mask in my pocket, and so forth. And I really like living in a place where I don't have to worry about holding my husband's hand as we walk down the street. And that's not true everywhere. So I'm actually almost as guilty as anyone else.
Well, that may be an interesting segue into another topic. And just so people know, all of the topics we're covering tonight were at Eric's suggestion, or at least with his agreement. So you had suggested that we do really talk about what was it like earlier, say in the 70s. What was it like coming out as a gay man here? And,
not a lot of fun. I came out in 1976, and I was 21. And frankly, I realized I was either going to come out of the closet or I was going to kill myself. And for whatever reason, I decided coming out of the closet would be less painful.
we're very glad you did.
I was one of those people who, when I finally did it, I was scared as all hell. But when I finally did it, it was like I took the TNT, piled it up next to the closet door and blew it up. There was no way I was going to go back in the closet after that. It was not subtle at all. And I lost some friends. I also made some of the closest friends of my college career at that time. There were people who, had been friendly, who were like, boy, you go. And so I still have friends to this day who I met, they're straight people, by the way. I'm not talking about gay people, I'm talking about straight people who are just like incredibly supportive. It would have been very rough without that. I have to say, my academic career took a little hiccup because not all the faculty were cool with my being gay.
Even at Berkeley.
Even at Berkeley.
Interesting.
But once I did, it became, I don't know if I would say a crusade. I wasn't like out there on the, carrying flags at the front of the parade, although there was one time when I was carrying the, one of the many people carrying the huge rainbow flag down Market Street at the front of the gay parade came out of BART, and it's like, we're looking for volunteers. It's like, okay, I'm in. So I guess I was kind of a flag waver of a sort. I was at a conference once, conference called Usenix. And at that point I was pretty out, but nothing particularly major. And somebody came over and wanted to talk to me, which was no surprise. Lots of people wanted to talk to me. And this guy was like really kind of a little off. And he said, can we go over there? And so I went over and he said, there's a rumor going around that you're gay. Is that true? I was like, oh yeah, you bet. And it turns out he's gay and was going through the whole thing. And for him, just knowing there was somebody who was a role model was so important to him. I don't know whatever happened to him, but I hope it worked well for him. And that very day, I went and I drew a pink triangle on my name badge. And by the end of that conference, probably a dozen people who had pink triangles. And that conference for many years was very gay positive. Unix is now very kind of staid academic conference. It was less so back then. But I think in that sense, I had indirectly an impact on a lot of people, and I'm very proud of that.
I was going to say, I hope you can be very proud of that, Eric. So, well, we've sort of moved into your private life a lot. Maybe stay in the private life a little less private. So many of the club members knew you probably first with you and your husband Kirk as the wine guys, both providing wonderful wine tasting sessions. If any of you are interested in tasting wine, we certainly are hoping we'll be able to get back to those in the new year as well as many other club events.
Actually, it's small enough that we are.
Are you going to do them?
We are doing them.
Okay, so you can even do that this.
There's one
this
next
year.
week, in fact.
And is there space?
I don't think so at this point.
So maybe November, if you're going to do one in November. How did your, and we're just not talking interest in wine. This is tremendous knowledge as well as remarkable collections of flights of various vineyards. How did that interest you?
I don't know exactly what inspired me to go into a place, a little wine shop here in Berkeley called North Berkeley Wines, which still exists, but they moved out of the little tiny place into a much larger place. And somewhere along there, they became too frou-frou for my taste. But I went in there and I talked to a guy, salesperson there, and said, I'm new to this. What should I, what do you recommend? And he suggested a couple things and I tried them and I went back and he said, which ones do you like? Which ones do you not like? And, so forth. And so he recommended other things. And I think the real thing was, there was a day that I got a bottle of wine. It was a Cabernet. 1976 Caymus Cabernet. Caymus is ridiculously overpriced today, but back then it was I think it was $12. And it was just the most amazing thing I'd ever tasted in my life. It's like, wow. And that's when I started saying, okay, I'm going to start tasting more wines. And that was actually before I met Kirk, but not too long after that I met him. And he seemed to be just fine with this. So, yeah, we got into tasting it. And at this point, at some point we did a remodel on our house and put in room for a wine cellar. It's, depending on your perspective, it's either huge or tiny. I know people where this is tiny, but it's like, 2,400 bottles of wine. So most people.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
And, we'd been to wine tastings and found them just tedious as all hell. I've never quite figured out what all the wine language is and so forth. It just seems so pretentious. And so at some point we said, it'd be nice to do a wine tasting which wasn't pretentious and was just about, maybe tasting the wine and maybe learning something about wine, so forth. And we were kind of newly into the Hillside Club. And at that point, it was relatively easy to book space. It's harder now. We have to work around all the other stuff going on. And we ended up doing this thing, which is, the rules are have fun, learn something, try and avoid the pretentious bullshit, and have a good time. And so we asked people to get their opinions, and we emphasize that your opinions do not have to be something you read out of a wine book. It can be, sometimes we have people go, number 1, yum. Number 2, yuck. And so
Their
forth.
candid opinion.
But the point is, and they're completely valid opinions.
Right.
And so I think people like to come to them because they don't end up walking away feeling like they're idiots. And for the most part, I always research the wines before I go in, as I want hopefully people to learn something.
Well, and just as you tried in your career in computer science, if you treat people with respect and have good intentions, that you will be rewarded. And it's the same with the wine tasting. So we, for the club, certainly appreciate them. And I know so many people have become members as a result of having a very good experience at the wine tasting. So I look forward to those continuing again. So since we're talking about the club, you know, you're newly president, you've exceeded in the presidency at a, of course, unusual time when,
Oh, boy.
an understatement, when the club has mostly been shuttered. We've just, you especially, and Jim, our immediate past president, have and their hiring committee have gone through a change of a search for a new manager. There's been so much truly unprecedented changes. But it would be lovely to hear about some of your goals for the club as we return to a more open situation.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious goal is, you know, let's start to breathe a little more life into things. That obviously will depend a great deal on stuff that's out of our control. I think that, let's just say I am hopeful that things are actually going to, maybe not quickly, but at least gradually get better from here on out. The whole Delta variant thing around the world seems to be finally ebbing.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in this area, California in general, compared to other states, and the Bay Area compared to the rest of California, have incredibly high vaccination rates. That speaks very, very well to our being able to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But there are other things too. I mean, you know, most of them are probably boring to anyone who's not a member, but I would like to try and get some work done on this beautiful building, which is, you know, built in 1924. It was rebuilt in 1924, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and unfortunately that costs money. So we're going to have to find out a way to do some fundraising. There's some other even more detailed or more boring stuff that is, I think, important, but doesn't exactly make anyone's heart beat faster, except maybe mine.
Seeing if there's any other items that we haven't covered, anything that you wanted to touch on that we've not yet talked about before we take some questions.
I'll probably think of something just as we finish the session. That's when I always think of the questions.
Well, with that, I'm just going to say a huge thank you to Eric, one for agreeing to have this conversation with me, but also just for agreeing to be president. One of the things was, why did he agree to be president? He kidded that, you know, in a moment of insanity, but in fact, he's already proven himself to be a wonderful president. We're extremely proud to have him as our leader for this next year, at least.
I will say, by the way, that I retired from the university just a couple months ago, and if I hadn't retired from the university, I wouldn't be able to do the president's job. It's a full-time job.
It is, which is why I didn't agree.
Yes, so you're smarter than I was.
So, no, they're all in good time. So this is an all volunteer group.
Yep.
And if you're listening, if you would like to join, we may have painted this picture of how much work there is, but mostly what Eric talked about in the wine tasting, our goal is mostly to just have a good time here, build a good community, maybe drink some lovely wine, hear some beautiful music. We have this fabulous, used to and shall again, have a fabulous concert series run by the voice of God here, Bruce Cobalt, who is, by the way, doing our filming this evening. Thank you, Bruce.
The guy behind the camera.
Yes. So are there any questions for Eric?
Was from Jeff Woodall. Could Eric expound on this ancient Sendmail related quote? The quote is, Sendmail is a living network whose flexibility is nothing short of amazing. How did Eric Allman embed this flexibility? He used a variation on post-production as an address rewriting. If he hadn't taken the theory course, none of us today would have Sendmail.
That sounds more like a kudo as opposed to a question.
It's a pretty geeky question, I have to admit, but it's true. I did use, it was called various things, production system. And I had taken a theory course. I'd also taken an AI course. And that technology, kind of spanned both theory and AI. And so we didn't go into this earlier, but when we started to get all these different networks connected together, so Sendmail was never just about the internet. It was about the internet and the UCP network and DECnet and CSNet and PurdueNet, and the number of networks out there were pretty amazing. And each one had a different way of addressing mail. And some of them, went left to right, and some of them went right to left, and it was just a complete other mess. And at some point, I think I said, this seems almost like an AI problem. Maybe I should use some AI techniques. And that's what I did. And I was absolutely certain when I was doing it that it was complete overkill. And I will say it was ugly, but it wasn't overkill.
Mm-hmm. So actually, an excellent question.
So let's see, Davis here asked Eric, you mentioned to me once that you wrote and implemented Sendmail in a way where if you'd known at the very beginning how pivotal it would be and how much infrastructure would lean on it, you would have done it differently. Can you talk about that?
Actually, it's not quite true that I would have done it differently in the original design. We were talking about various systems that were extremely limited. And so the PP11 was, like I said, your watch has more computing power than this thing. And I was trying to build something very general, and to do that required some design choices that I'm not particularly proud of, but it worked, and that's what I cared about most of all. But there was one time in particular when at that point, I had an installed base of Sendmail, people running it, and I looked at it and went, I should really redesign this. I said, I can't do that. I have an installed base. There's 100 people who have this now, and I couldn't break all of them. It's like, no, Eric, don't think of 100, think of 100 million.
Right.
And I certainly would have, if I had any idea of how successful it was going to be, I would have gone back then and broken those 100 people. It's funny, there's another kind of famous computer science guy who built a fundamental tool for Unix called Make, which is how you build programs and so forth, Stu Feldman. And he made a design decision, which actually I kind of copied in Sendmail, and it was a mistake. And I asked Stu, so why did you do it this way? And he said, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I said, yeah, but why didn't you change it when it became clear it wasn't? And he said, well, it had gone out to like 30 or 40 people. And so I didn't feel I could change it. It's like,
right.
Oh, we both made
Right.
the same mistake for the same reason.
Right. And if you could do it over again, would you try to monetize it? Would you try to have sold Sendmail?
Well, I did. I started a company called Sendmail. This is actually an interesting question, quite apropos to what we were talking about. We were one of the first companies that tried to merge open source and commercial without doing a technology ripoff from the open source. And, you know, we were actually fairly successful. At one point, we were actually a pretty hot company. But at some point, the spam wars started to come in. You know, when I wrote Sendmail in the first place, the whole point was to get the mail there no matter what. And spam came along and started to be, well, get the mail there unless, of course, you don't like it, in which case, please throw it away. And it was a very strange change in perspective. But it was proposed to me at one point that we say, well, suppose every time some site out there on the internet processes mail using Sendmail, it sends us back a message saying, you know, here's where it came from, here's where it went to, some statistics about it. And that would give us a leg up on the anti-spam problem, because one of the patterns is a whole bunch of mail,
right.
all at the same time, same size, et cetera. And I just said, absolutely not. You know, put my foot down. That's a violation of people's privacy. And so we didn't do it. Of course, another company did, and they ended up winning over us. And so the interesting question is, you know, do I regret? You know, I'd be several orders of magnitude richer if I had, you know, gone that direction. And I didn't stop the problem from happening. So, you know, maybe I should have made the money, but I don't really think I would feel comfortable in my own skin if I had done that.
That's not who you were.
It's not
And
how
that's
I
still
was.
not who you are.
Yeah.
And we're glad. Maybe not for your fight, for your bank account, but for the person that you are.
You know, I'm comfortable.
There we go.
And that's really, you know, I have friends that are billionaires, and I think I actually am probably about as happy as they are.
There we go.
Well, let's see, Anita in Middle asks, do you have any involvement with the homebrew computer club? Did or when did you get into Apples or PCs?
Homebrew kind of predated me, and it was very much South Bay, and I didn't even own a car. I didn't even know how to drive until I was in my early 20s. It's, you know, I was purely bus and bicycle for a long time. So, you know, getting down to homebrew meetings was not something that was practical. I certainly today know a lot of people who were involved in it. I go to well, it used to be annual until pandemic hit, but a conference called the Hackers Conference, which is based on the Jay Levy book from way back when called Hackers. And a whole bunch of the homebrew folks are regulars there, so I've gotten to know them. When I was in high school, I realized I could never possibly afford to buy a computer. It was way too expensive. I did not come from a wealthy family. So I decided I was going to build my own. And so I started, you know, studying computer architecture, and I actually had the blueprints to the PDP-8E computer, which was a digital equipment computer. And I spent hours and hours and hours digging through, trying to understand what the purpose of every single gate in these blueprints, and learned a lot about computer architecture that way. Never did get my computer working, but, you know, hey, I learned something. And then actually, I guess I got involved with the IBM 1401 before that. What was my first sort of personal computer, though? Wasn't a Mac, couldn't afford a Mac. It's probably a 386 architecture, so, you know, kind of a PC, because I was involved with the Berkeley Unix project. And, well, not officially, I was unofficially involved. And when FreeBSD came out, it ran on the i386 architecture. Previously, it had run on the VAXs. I did a lot of work on the VAX. But, you know, the VAX is not exactly something you just put in your basement and plug
No.
in.
So Rick Rogers asks, given that the word email is clearly the root of mail, does it disturb you to hear people talking about emails?
Oh, Rick, I'd never thought about that question before. You know, I guess I would probably say email, but it's not sufficiently jarring to me that I would, you know, get my hair up over it. It's in the grand scheme of all the things wrong with the universe, it's a pretty tiny one.
Here's our old friend Tim Bozar.
Ah, hello, Tim.
Sendmail is one of those tools that reminds me of KA9QNOS. I believe Phil Karn's caption of TCP/IP for back radio.
Oh, yes.
And it was kind of a Swiss Army knife that could handle anything.
Yes. And the question is?
I think you're just
Jeff
comment.
Goodell is back here saying, can you give some backstory with respect to the Sendmail debug command that led to the Robert Captain Morris Internet Worms?
Oh.
I can see it cringing also.
No, actually, this is a good story. So for those who don't know, I put in a command in Sendmail that I could connect to remotely and say, you know, debug, and it would give me basically permissions that I wasn't supposed to have on that computer, big permissions on that computer. So why did I do something like that? Well, it turns out that this was back when Sendmail was being used on campus, and I was at least a part-time student, and there was a bug on one of the computers, but it was one of the computers that was used for administrative computing. And they said, so there's this bug. And I said, well, you know, let me come in and look at it. They said, oh, we can't let you onto that computer. You're a student. You don't have authorization to get to that computer. I said, well, I can't fix your problem then. Oh, no, you have to fix our problem. Like, I can't. You have to. You can't. You have to. They wouldn't let me onto the computer, but I did send them saying something like, here's a new version. I've done some stuff to it. Why don't you install it and try it out? And that gave me the access to the machine that I needed to actually fix their problem. And if they had never done that, the debug command would never have happened. It was like they were unrealistic about the security. Now, it is totally my fault that I did not immediately remove the debug command. And that was frankly because, wow, it was so useful there, I might need that again.
There we go.
And at some point I kind of forgot about it, and it was out way too far on the net. That was just pure stupidity. So I apologize for that.
Okay, Tim Bozar chimes back in regarding spam. We, referring here right now, spam or Sendmail to create Sendmail's quote unquote filters. I'm assuming that contraction of mail filters.
That is correct. Mail filters.
So Sendmail's critical in helping us with anti-spam. And then Rob Kennedy, who's also on board, is also on this call here. Right? Hey, Rob. He said, how about involvement in Lee? I guess that's Lee Felsenstein's People Computer Club or Computer Memory.
Well, Lee was definitely one of the homebrew folks. I know Lee, but I've never really worked with him directly, so I can't speak to exactly what he was doing. I was, when I was an undergrad, kind of hung out with some people from the, what was it called? The computer club, I guess, or something like that.
Community memory?
We had actually a really interesting, completely bizarre machine in the basement of Corey Hall called a UNIVAC SS90. He used to hang out there among all this weird loud equipment and so forth. And I think Lee actually was there sometimes. There were a few people who, you know, at the time they were just like these guys I hung out with, and looking back on it, I went, oh no, they were famous people, or they became famous people. So, but I can't actually speak specifically to Lee's things. No, Postfix is another mailer, a competitor to Sendmail, written by Vitsa Venema. When Vitsa was writing Postfix, he spent a lot of time looking over Sendmail and studying it. And in fact, he contributed a bunch of improvements to it as he was writing. I mean, this is the way open source is supposed to work. I remember distinctly at one point going into a conference hall, and you know, it's dark because, you know, and I see Vitsa sitting toward the back of the room, and I sit down next to him and say, so how's the mailer going? And he goes, well, it's taking longer than I expected. I said, it's harder than it looks, isn't it? And Vitsa goes, it's been an exercise in humility. Postfix is good work. And, you know, he learned a lot from Sendmail. I don't agree with all of the design decisions. I think, you know, there's some things I certainly would not have done the same way he did. But it's a good, solid piece of work. If I were not going to be running Sendmail, that's probably the one I would look at.
We have one more question on the name Alex, the article. And where in lifetime of Sendmail, the phishing attacks become, you ever consider such social email?
So the second half first, no. You know, I certainly, when I was building it, I was building, at least in my mind, a piece of technology, not a social engineering issue. You know, in retrospect, you know, any communication technology, you know, print newspapers are subject to social engineering. And I don't think email is any different than that. I suppose that's actually kind of the answer to the first half as well. There's nothing I could have done in Sendmail that would prevent social engineering, because social engineering is all about the content of the message. And, you know, classic social engineering thing is you call somebody up and you say, you know, I work in your company, you know, you don't know me, but I work in this other department and I'm having trouble with this. Can you help me out? I need the password to this and such. It's amazing how often that works. And there's absolutely nothing I could have done to the mail system to prevent that. So I wish.
Is there a Jack Gilbert poem that you can recite?
Yes, he handed me that. I'm growing old in San Francisco. Two girls barefoot walking in the rain. Both girls lovely. One of them is sane. Hurting me softly, hurting me though. Two girls barefoot walking in the snow. Walking in the white snow, walking in the black. Two girls barefoot, never coming back.
And with that, we have learned more about our president, Eric Allman, than you might ever have guessed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming this evening.
Good night.